I think we'll make a start now. So good morning and good afternoon to all of you from around the world who are joining us today. I'm seeing a really diverse audience today. I mentioned this last time in Mark Sargent's webinar last week, but we're seeing such a global attendee network, such as members of the UK, Lithuania, Oman, South Africa, Kenya. So we're really pleased to have such a global following. So welcome to our final installment of Taking Integrity Online. This is the last episode of this three-part series, which has been created to help you as educators uphold academic integrity as we look toward what could be a permanent future of blended learning, who knows. If you did join us for our first and second episodes, you'll know that in this series we've partnered with higher education integrity specialists from the University of Northampton, Nottingham Trent University, and now today we're joined by Loughborough University and Loughborough Student Union. So all of our guests are actively managing the challenges of upholding academic integrity in predominantly a remote environment, and this is a change that none of us planned for, but as we're here today, you're clearly taking that first step into a successful transition. So today we're joined by Professor Sandie Dann, who has been chair of Loughborough University's Academic Misconduct Committee since 2014. And with Sandie is Kit Messenger, an advice development consultant within Loughborough University's Student Union. So we're really happy to have you both here. Just before we make a start, I'd like to cover some basic webinar housekeeping rules, just so that you're all in the know. So today's session will be around the 45-minute mark, might be slightly longer, and all attendees are muted for the entirety of the webinar, but you can use the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So you should just be able to see that box there to submit any questions to Sandie and Kit that you'd like to be addressed at the end. We ask that you only use the chat to say hello rather than asking any questions, as it can be a little bit difficult to follow. For any questions that we do deem unsuitable for broadcast, we might not have the answer for you right now. We will respond to you in the background if we can, or we'll respond to you by email later. I'm also pleased to advise that the recording for this session will be available in around 48 hours from now, so on Friday the 14th, and we'll send you an email to let you know, and that's the same for any colleagues that you have that mightn't have been able to make it today. So now that that's all said and done, I'd like to pass you over to our guests to let them introduce themselves a little bit more and deliver their webinar on partnering with the Student Union to promote academic integrity. So good luck, Sandie and Kit, over to you.
Hello everyone. So my name is Sandie Dann and I'm from Loughborough University, and I'm joined by Kit Messenger from Loughborough Students' Union. What we hope to do in the next half an hour or so is to share some of our experiences in joining forces to support students with their academic integrity. So what we're going to do is we will start with our biographies to explain how we both became interested in academic integrity matters. We'll then move on to explain how the Student Union and the university ended up working together in this space. I think it will be fair to say that some people won't really understand and think this is rather an unusual alliance. We'll then move on to show you some examples of our initiatives. So we're going to talk about an exam hall campaign. We're also going to talk about a coursework campaign about being a good scholar. Then finally, we're going to talk about an academic integrity test, which we've introduced across the institution. Following acknowledgements, we'll then move to questions from the virtual floor. So please use the questions and answers as we go along, as Laura asked for you to do. Okay, so starting with a bit about me. So I joined the university in 1997. And I've spent many years in student-facing roles. So I've been programme directors, I have been the senior tutor for the whole of the department. Therefore, I'm used to consulting with students and listening to the student voice and following up on and acting on those representations from the students. So if you like, it's second nature to me to talk to students about things and try to improve things. In 2014, I became Associate Dean for Teaching for the School of Science. And as part of that role, I took on the chair of the University Academic Misconduct Committee. And from that point on, I've become hooked, I would say, on academic integrity matters. As well as chairing the major panels, I provide training and support across the university for academic staff and for students. So for example, we do training for students and for staff on the academic probationers course. I do a session on that. In 2019, with Robin Crockett and Irene Glendinning, we set up the Midlands Integrity Group. And this is a regional interest group who get together periodically to talk about academic integrity matters. So if you are in the Midlands and you would like to join us, we'll be very pleased to hear from you. We'll give you the details how to do that at the end.
Hello everyone, I'm Kit Messenger. After graduating in 2017 and briefly working as a student communications intern within the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough, I moved to the Students' Union to the role of Student Voice Assistant, where I had greater opportunity to develop experience and passion for student support. Becoming increasingly involved in the delivery of advice to students, I then became the Advice Development Consultant for the service. This means that I work to continually improve the service, as well as working alongside colleagues such as Sandie at the university to feedback and improve on the university's processes that involve students. Whilst in my current role as well, I also sat upon the Student Minds Advisory Committee, and from this I'm really passionate about ensuring that students' mental health is protected as possible when engaging with university's processes, both by the support that they receive and the processes that they're actually going through as well.
So the next slide looks at the 3 levels of proof, which was presented by Kath Ellis at the Turnitin Summit. I'm using this slide to explain how I fit into the academic misconduct process and the academic integrity around that. So I certainly take the role of the academic who occasionally might spot something in a marking that looks like a case of academic misconduct. So I'm certainly involved at that kind of level. However, that happens relatively occasionally. The role that I don't take is I don't take the role of the integrity officer or integrity lead. And I think Robin Crockett has already discussed this in the first session of this series. So this is the person who identifies and works with the marking academic to collect evidence, etc. So I'm definitely not in that kind of role. So my role is the marking academic, but more often than not, I am in the role of the chair of the Academic Misconduct Committee. So this is the major Academic Misconduct Committee that sits across the entire university. So we have penalties available from formal warnings all the way through to terminations of studies, and we deal with the most serious forms of academic misconduct, so where there's definite intent, where there are repeat offences. So these are the serious forms of academic misconduct. There are also minor panels that sit in schools, and they deal with sort of minor offences. So we've got 9 schools, and in those 9 schools there will be a minor panel with a minor chair, but my responsibility is for the major panel. So as yet, it's probably not very clear to you how we might be working together, the student union and the chair of the AMC, in trying to look at academic integrity issues. But hopefully it becomes clearer when we start looking at how our panels are arranged. So our major academic misconduct panels consist of 5 people. As well as the academics, there is also a member of the student union executive. So this is normally the education officer, and they sit on the panel with other members of the academic staff. As well as sitting on a panel, there are also likely to be a member of the student advice sitting on the other side of the table. So students are allowed to bring with them to meetings a person of their choice. So they can bring all sorts of people, but often they choose to bring with them a member of the student advice. So if you like, we have got student union on both sides of our table, both reviewing cases on the panel, but also supporting students through their processes. So what happens then in that arrangement is that from our relative perspectives, we can see all sorts of things that go wrong. So these can be misunderstandings of the rules, for example, or it can be cases where people have deliberately tried to cheat. So this led us to think in this arrangement about how we might stop some of those cases even happening. So we started thinking about how we might work together to reduce our cases, give the panels less work, if you like. As well as working on the panels, the student union and myself also sit on working groups. So we've sat on working groups, for example, to revise the academic misconduct regulations and to generate policies. I also engage with the student union when we introduce anything new in the academic misconduct space. So, for example, we recently purchased Authorship Investigate from Turnitin, and during the process of implementing that, the student union were involved, so they were aware of the process, because they cannot advise students if they don't understand what's fully going on.
Thanks, Sandie. So a bit more about LSU Advice. We provide an independent advice service to students when they're engaging with university processes. This might be at whatever stage of the process they're at, and also regardless of whether they are admitting or denying the offence. Typically, for academic misconduct cases, students will contact us after they've received the allegation letter. Sometimes we'll see them before, but it's usually after, and before they've provided any response to the committee, ideally. We can help students understand their options and their rights, what it is that they've been accused of, and also to make them feel less alone in what can be quite an isolating and for some students a shameful feeling process. In terms of the practical help that we can give them, this consists of reviewing drafts of the written response that they're entitled to provide, ensuring that the letter is clear, relevant, and outlines any mitigation that they wish to present to the committee. As Sandie's mentioned already, we can also accompany students to hearings, primarily for moral support, but where appropriate, where we might be able to assist in rephrasing any tricky questions that they might not understand.
Okay, so moving on then to think about how we work together to prevent academic misconduct. So I think it's generally accepted that you need to think about a variety of things when you're thinking about academic misconduct and academic integrity. So firstly, it's about thinking about training our students. So we really need to train our students well at the beginning to make sure they understand what is expected of them. So it wouldn't be right to start handing out penalties if they didn't know what they should be doing and we hadn't trained them in the first place to understand it. In the second point, it's about training staff. So staff need to be able to know and understand and spot academic misconduct, and they need to make sure that they report that. As well as that, they need to take assessment design very seriously to make it as hard to cheat as possible. Probably though, the most important thing is around a community of practice where all the players understand what's going on and everyone behaves consistently. The information is presented in a way that everybody understands, so that we make sure that everybody knows what's expected of them. Particularly for students, they really need to understand what they've done wrong. So it has to be very clear to them what they've done wrong and how they can go about improving and rectifying it so they don't do it again. So it's very important to all of us that these things happen, that we train the students, they understand what they've done wrong, and we help them to direct them to places where they will get help and what won't happen again. Having said all that, I would say that if we were looking at some of the causes that allow academic misconduct to happen, that they can be divided into different groups. And I'll say that I think I'm a realist about this and not an idealist. So in some cases, academic misconduct can happen because students don't know very much or have not made themselves aware, or they do it by accident, essentially. And we can do things to help them. That we can improve the information, make sure it's available in a timely way so that it reminds them not to do certain things at a time, and we can give them better training. There are students that commit academic misconduct because their time management is awful and that it's out of desperation or laziness. And we can try and help them by identifying the challenges and giving them alternatives and saying, if this has happened to you, please try this. Don't go on to cheat. Redirect them and help and try to help them that way. There's a third group who think that they aren't going to be caught and all the penalties might be weak in what they see. So we can make it very clear to them that is not the case, that they will be caught, and that the fact that if they are, that the penalties are really serious. So we can raise awareness and make them understand that it really is very serious if you're caught for academic misconduct. And finally, we have to accept there's a group that is determined to cheat and to cut our losses and to accept that there are battles that you cannot win. But for these first three groups, we feel that there are things that we can do and to try and help students, to redirect them and to prevent academic misconduct. So largely it's the first three examples that we'll be talking about. So when I first joined the Academic Misconduct Committee, there were multiple incidents of students taking forbidden items into the examination hall. At the time, Amy Ward was the LSU Education Executive, and we worked together on a plan to try and stop some of these things happening. And we called this plan the 7 deadly sins of academic misconduct. So here's a few examples of the things that were happening. So students aren't allowed to take blank paper to enter exams. The university has a calculated list. You can only use the calculators on that list. You can't use any others, for example. Or a student had left their mobile phone in their pocket, and it's so part of the natural culture that they need to remember that they need to leave it at home. So as part of this process, we were trying to think of ways how we could give the information to them in a timely way to remind them to not do any of these things. So what we started with was a variety of things that were available there and then when it came to the examination. So for example, we had these posters that you can see on the left-hand side outside the examination hall. And I can genuinely say we haven't had an example of a blank piece of paper in the exam for ages since we've been doing this. So it is fair to say that during this process, we put the posters up. We also had information appearing on the screens as students were logging in during revision time. So it would come up and direct them to the guide to make sure that they were aware of the processes. So during that process, we did also find that certain groups had certain issues, and through that, we needed to follow up in particular areas.
So as Sandie said, it was important for us not just to observe the trends in these demographics, but to use this information to partner with and deliver information to relevant groups. For instance, here we're just about to watch a video led by George Holmes, who was a postgraduate officer at the time, and this was delivered as part of Postgraduate Speak Week. Perhaps unfortunately for George, the videos got really good traction with students on social media and throughout the postgraduate community at Loughborough.
No revision notes or notes of any kind are allowed into the exam hall. In fact, you're not even allowed your own blank paper. Accidentally breaking the rules is still breaking the rules. Do you know the exam rules?
So that was targeting the right students and working together to work towards certain groups, and that gives one an example where we did something together as part of the university, and they also targeted particularly using their social groups. Moving on then from the exam hall campaign, we followed up with the coursework campaign, and this had more iterations. So we looked at this over a number of years to get it right. So there were various reviews and changes to it, and I'll explain why that came up shortly. So this included banners within the university, for example, at student information desks, for example, and it also had cartoons playing in the student union. The coursework campaign again came up from seeing cases and seeing things that were going wrong and students not perhaps understanding everything that they needed to understand. So what we were trying to do was to prevent students making mistakes by accident, really. It was really important to get the wording right for this. So in some of this sort of information tends to be tied up in very complicated language. So we spent quite a long time with this, going through the wording to make sure it was really student friendly, and that it was very clear in that information that we were directing students to help at various stages during the process. This information was originally, as I said, in banners, etc., but we've now got it in a dedicated area which is all around student support, which you can see down there on the left hand side of the slide.
So as well as tackling some of the more accidental incidents of academic misconduct, we've also been changing our messaging to try and deter the more intentional incidences as well. For instance, here we have a GIF that was used to kind of warn against contract cheating by being really upfront with students about the academic and personal risks that it poses to them. We've also really tried to acknowledge in the work that we've been doing that it's a responsibility of both the university and the students' union to acknowledge where there are issues happening, whether that's with plagiarism or contract cheating or other types of misconduct, and offering preemptive support, alternatives to cheating, and also as part of the students' union, facilitating safe spaces such as our advice service, where students can come and discuss with us openly their situation, and that in turn helps their engagement with the academic misconduct process.
So just to say that we don't always, however, get it right. So in our first iteration of the coursework campaign, we used this strapline, which was "Don't be a copycat." And this had been successfully used a few years previously in highlighting issues with plagiarism. However, we found that in just moving on a few years changes how people react to certain things. So it was really important, we realised after running this, that we needed to speak to all of the student body, and some of the terminology that we used early on didn't speak to all the students. So we consulted the students through Education Week at one point to make sure that everything was very clear, and they felt that the term "don't be a copycat" didn't speak to everyone. So that's why we changed it to the Good Scholar Guide. So I can't emphasize enough, I think, the importance of getting enough student feedback on everything that you do before you put it to the student body. So I've had a lot of experience on sitting on major panels now for very many years. So this led me to reflect on how students were supported through the academic misconduct processes. Generally, we have this arrangement is that students are allowed to submit a written defence. They're allowed to attend a panel meeting of the major or minor in person, and when they attend in person, they can bring in an accompanying person of their choice. They can also call any witnesses they wish to call in our meetings. As you see, I've highlighted there, accompanied by a person of their choice. Often students choose to bring someone from the student union to help them in these environments. It's my observation that students that are supported by Student Voice were better prepared for those panel meetings. They wrote much better letters of response that were more focused on the kind of things that we would be interested in, and they were less likely to repeat offences, so we didn't tend to see them back in our meetings. So it's about the ability of Student Voice to really understand the processes, because they are involved in those university systems that make them really useful to students. So what we really want to do is to encourage students to use Student Voice as much as possible when they go to meetings, to actually to sing by the right song sheet, essentially. Now, we've done a lot as we can from the committee point of view. In our allegation letter, it clearly advises them to go and speak to Student Voice in the student union. And we've also said that we will help that process for them as well, as so any information that they wanted copying to Student Voice, we would do that as well. So we do that as part of the panel, but that's probably the limit to what we can do, is to encourage them to speak to Student Voice. So with that, I hand over to Kit.
Yeah, thanks, Sandie. So we do acknowledge that some students will still be reluctant to approach us for advice. And whilst there's always more that we could be doing to extend and improve our outreach to students, we do now have lots of upfront advice available on our web pages, as you can see on the screen now. So here we've got a really detailed set of frequently asked questions which are available for any student to access. Importantly for these were co-produced with students to make sure that we were answering the questions that students actually had, rather than the questions that we kind of automatically assumed that they might have. As with any co-production though, it's really important to recognise what information you must deliver to the students, but might not be actively requested. So there are, of course, the answers to the questions that students don't necessarily want to hear. For example, whether it's a possibility that their studies might be terminated. Yes, it is. But including that information within here has really helped to manage their expectations of the process and the outcomes that they can expect. And also make sure that they aren't kind of blindsided by the process once that's kind of got started. So moving on from that, we've also been kind of changing our tone on social media and communications more generally as well. We've definitely made a switch from the kind of reactive, if you have an allegation, come and see us, to more of a, if you're struggling with your studies or personal circumstances, or you're considering committing academic misconduct out of desperation, as we've spoken about earlier, then come and see us at that point. Again, we've really done this by trying to capture the student voice by using relatable and real scenarios that we've seen in the cases that have come to us, to prompt engagement with our service, and again, consequently, the academic misconduct process as well.
Okay, so moving on then, the next thing I wanted to talk about was the university-wide academic integrity test. This is going back to talking about how we train students in academic integrity and the sort of things that we see regularly come up at major and minor panels. So it was fairly clear that depending on where students were in the university, they got a different experience and training in integrity. So what we wanted to do was to make sure that they all had at least the same base experience of being trained. So together with Hannah Barton, who was the education exec at the time, we started looking at covering the sort of core issues that were occurring over and over in panel meetings, and trying to make sure that these were covered in any integrity training. So as you can see in this panel here, the integrity test is now part of any student induction to the university. So all students, whatever program they're on, have to do the academic integrity test. It consists of 22 questions, and we make sure that it was worded in an appropriate way by doing a lot of testing. So originally, a lot of the work was done by student advice and myself, and we had academics and members of the registry feeding back on that test. But also we had some testing groups with students to make sure that we could make the wording as super student friendly as possible so that students would remember it and engage with it. I would like to say that this is about principles. It is not about studying referencing conventions. So we accept that all different sorts of subject referencing conventions are acceptable in different subjects. So this is specifically about principles, not specifics. So here's an example of one of the questions. So this question is about a scenario that people that sit on panels probably recognize. And this is the student who unfortunately has wanted to do their friend a favour. They were worried about their friend because they weren't very well, and they asked to borrow their work, and they've said yes, and they've led themselves into all sorts of misery. So the idea is to cover the kind of scenarios that we were seeing and trying to find alternatives for students to go elsewhere. The last thing I want to talk about is that in recent years we've found that more and more students of our honest students, as it says there, want to tell someone when they've found someone cheating. So whether it's people colluding on social media over some sort of assignment that's supposed to be individual, for example, that is an example, or something else, they are keen to tell us. They are often angry about how unfair it is when they'd worked really hard and somebody else has decided to take the easy route and cheat. So we wanted to recognise that and find a way to support students to allow them to tell people. What they were telling us was that they didn't really know who to tell, and they were worried about coming forward because they didn't know what to expect. So if they told somebody, what would happen? So what we decided to do was to look at a whistleblowing policy for academic matters, and this now mirrors what the existing policy was already in place for student discipline, but there wasn't one for academic misconduct. So we have implemented one for academic misconduct, and it's presented there. So the idea is that the student knows where to go to and they know how they will be treated. We also encourage any student who is going to whistleblow to speak to the student union first, to student advice, to make sure that they understand what's likely to happen. So finally then, so what is next? So Kit's recently had an excellent idea about an academic integrity awareness test, so I'm just going to pass over to her for that.
Thank you. Yeah, so we will soon begin our planning and exploring options for integrating an academic integrity awareness course to form part of the outcomes for academic misconduct, along the same sort of lines as a speed awareness course. In this way, we hope to kind of reduce repeat offenders, but also most importantly, offer students an opportunity for them to learn and reflect on their scholarly practice so that they don't end up in a similar or worse situation in the future.
I'm very keen that anybody is in the Midlands that would like to join our academic integrity group does so. So my contact details is sitting there at the bottom. So please come along and join us and share your practices across academic integrity and academic misconduct. I'd also like to link to other academic integrity groups so that we can share practice, because I'm aware that this is quite a fast moving area, particularly in the areas of contract cheating. So it's very good for us to share our practices. So please contact me there at my email address on the bottom. it remains for me to acknowledge and thank some people. So I would like to thank obviously the team from the LSU advice. There are then a list of the various executive members of the student union who have joined me in various campaigns and helped to target particular groups. All the members of the AMC, past and present, and indeed the academic registry, particularly Chris Dunbobbin, who is my partner in crime in many of these things. So thank you all very much for your attention, and we will now move back to Laura and go to questions.
Yeah, so Sandie, I think there's a really good question here for you. Do you publish the penalty framework and communicate the outcomes, for example, a summary of the cases completely anon?
So we have a penalty framework. Oh, hang on a minute. We have a penalty framework that is available to everyone, so that that was published 2015 now, so that is it, everyone can see what that is. We also produce an annual report, anonymised report, which goes to the University Learning and Teaching Committee on Academic Misconduct Matters. So we look at lots of different cases and make a summary and look at where we need to put resources going forward.
Another question from Jordan Dawson. He said that the student-centred campaigns are great. Have you seen a decline in the number of cases related to the topics in recent years?
So certainly we see a lot less of the academic, so we see a lot less of the incidents where things have happened by accident. So we've increased the awareness, and working together with the students means that we're speaking from the same song sheet, and students are more likely to engage, I think. So I think that has definitely contributed into a lot less cases in those areas. Yes, I think that's made a difference.
And then the second part of his question, where do you go next with this focus? I think for us it's kind of continuing with the preventative aspect of it. So whether that's reducing second offenders or reducing the amount of cases occurring at all. And I think again that's kind of with more thorough courses, such as the idea I mentioned at the end of our PowerPoint, really getting students to reflect and understand why they've been penalised and why their work has been flagged, because I think that's an issue in some cases, that students, once they get that allegation, they're still not understanding what it was that the problem was to begin with.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Is that the idea of the following up after the cases is something that we're going to look into this year, because I think it's really important that we make sure that students avoid repeating the same mistakes again.
Yep. Another question, it's quite a good one. How many appeals do you see against your penalties? Has it reduced following the campaigns?
We don't actually see very many appeals against our cases. It's a very small number, actually. It's make it very clear what the position is through the penalty framework as well, so students often know what they're expecting. There are appeals occasionally where there are students who, for whatever reason, didn't disclose information at the time. So they may have had they might be having a different experience at the time and didn't know to disclose information. So we do have examples of appeals through that.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, I think that campaigns have helped to reduce the appeals as well, because students are more at ease with the outcome that they've given, because they might look back on their piece of work and acknowledge that academic misconduct has happened, and therefore once they've understood that, they've been more accepting of the outcome itself. Just seeing if there's any more questions for us to answer.
So interestingly, Kit, what social media platform do we use that we found the best dissemination for the students?
So we have been using Facebook and Twitter. We've generally found Facebook to be best at the moment. We do hope to kind of branch out more into kind of more international social media platforms such as Weibo, and we do have that for our satellite campus. It does have a larger international student population. Student emails coming from the Students' Union as well has been a really good way of encouraging students to come to us for advice as well.
Okay. So I think there are a number of other questions which are going to take a long time to reply. So I will reply to them, but probably I think that's probably back to Laura.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that, Sandie and Kate. That was fantastic. I just wanted to reiterate that all of the resources that Sandie and Kate have mentioned today are available via the link on screen now, and that includes even more videos and GIFs than you've seen today in the presentation. So I encourage you to have a look at them, because the videos aren't just informative, but they're also really amusing as well. They're really entertaining, so I'd definitely suggest that you take a look at them. So as I mentioned earlier, this episode is the final live session in our 3-part series. However, recordings for the previous episode, so that's on the telltales of contract cheating, our newest solution, Turnitin originality, and conducting misconduct panels are now all available. So I'm just gonna move to the next slide. You can find that at go.turnitin.com/TIO. We'd love for you to use them within your institutions for best practices and advice, and share them with those who may be interested in watching. And just finally, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Sandie and Kit. We've met up several times over the past few months in planning this particular webinar, and it's just a really, I would say, refreshing topic to talk about. It's fantastic to see such a different approach to what usually is a really formal process. And it also, just to improve that student communication, it really eases the tension when misconduct allegations do arise. It's really stressful, it's really anxious for students, and it's just great to have that source of advice where you don't feel like you're in trouble, you feel like you're talking to more or less a human being. So yeah, I really appreciate that advice, and for all the questions that we've had as well. I can see that this is a topic that a lot of people are interested in. So I'll be working with Sandie and Kit to follow up on the questions that everybody has asked today, and we'll be able to get those responses out to you. And maybe even a few of the questions, you don't kind of consider these things until you're asked questions from an external source. So it's quite enlightening to see what people want to know about, and hopefully that's helped you both, Sandie and Kit, as well.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
So if anybody has any questions at all further to this, email address is on screen. I can act as a facilitator between everybody here today and Sandie and Kit, so just send any emails my way. And again, thank you very much everyone for joining us. Is there anything that you'd like to add, Sandie and Kit, before we close for the day?
Just thank you for coming, everyone.
Indeed, thank you very much for engaging with us.
No problem at all. We're very happy to have you here. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.